give you a sense of how we as digital citizens of this planet are evolving from a physical past to a digital future. And how are those evolution pathways different when you go from an India to a China to an Indonesia to an Estonia to Canada? And what do those patterns say about where the future lies? And what are some of the issues that we should be excited about? And what are some of the issues we could be worried about? So what we did was we created a digital evolution index. And the idea was to take this very complicated reality that we are all a part of and reduce it to something really simple and create an index. An index is literally a score. It's a crude way of creating an apples to apples comparison across a whole bunch of countries and markets. So we picked 60 countries and we created an index to rank these countries. And the way this sausage making machine worked was we took an enormous amount of data of about 170 different variables, and we organized them into supply side indicators, demand side indicators, institutional indicators, and innovation indicators. And kind of pulled it together, and this is for 60 countries, and managed to get a score for every country. And after a lot of analytical gymnastics, a graph appears. Now, I know that this graph is very difficult to read, so let me unpack it for you by just giving you the broad patterns of what is here. So what is on this graph are those 60 countries mapped according to two dimensions. The vertical dimension, the north-south dimension, is how the country fared on the digital evolution score. So the further to the north you are, the more digitally evolved the country is. The further to the south, the less digitally evolved. And then there is the horizontal left to right dimension. The further to the right you are, the more momentum you have. So one is the state of digital evolution, the other is the rate of digital evolution. The rate basically kind of says how quickly you're moving. And the reason why both these measures are important is, say for instance, if I'm trying to compare India with Sweden, it doesn't make any sense. Why would I compare India with Sweden? Sweden is in a very different socioeconomic phase than India is. But perhaps a different way to look at India is how quickly is India moving relative to Sweden. And that gives me a different read of what is happening in terms of the digital activity. And so this is how this map is organized. And we can mark out 4 major clusters of where countries lie. So there is a cluster called the standout cluster. These are countries that are rock stars. They are both high in state and high in rate. And examples of such countries are countries like Singapore, New Zealand, Estonia, Israel, the UAE. And then there are what I call the stall-out countries. These are the countries primarily what Donald Rumsfeld once called Old Europe. So you can see most of France and Germany and the Scandinavian countries up there. They're like more mature people where the knees have got arthritic, so they can't really move very fast, and so they've developed digital arthritis. So they have a very high level of evolution, but their rate is not that high. So they are what we call the stall-out countries. And then there are the watch-out countries that are sort of struggling on all fronts. And then the breakout countries, which in many ways are the most exciting corner of this map. And these breakout countries are the ones that attract investor attention, entrepreneurial attention, and an enormous amount of kind of arbitrage attention. And so these are countries that haven't achieved their potential, plenty of headroom, and enormous amount of momentum. And you can see the countries that are there are many countries right in our neighborhood, here in Asia, Southeast Asia, India included, and some in Latin America. And the other important part of this mapping is if I were to now layer population on top of this, in each of these countries, if I were to put a bubble there with the size of the bubble representing the population, most of the big bubbles are going to be in the bottom right. So now put on your investor hat. Where would you go? Momentum times mass means investment opportunity. The mass is the population, the momentum is what is here, and the bottom right is where money is going to flow. And if you start tracking private equity and venture dollars, that's where they're going. So there are a lot of conversations I can have just by stopping on this page alone. But I could do that, but maybe just let me share a few other ideas, and we can come back to some of the implications of what is here. So I just wanted to situate India for you. It is in that nice breakout zone, but it's not at the front of the pack in terms of momentum. It's certainly kind of middling of the pack in terms of the developing nations. And now to actually break it down by individual categories, in terms of demand momentum, India is actually very strong. That's that star that was circling around there. So it's kind of on the far right. Now, when I look at supply, you can see that it's actually doing surprisingly, quite nicely in terms of the change in supply infrastructure is being reflected over here. But now, when you look at the institutional environment in India, that's where it is kind of right at that median. So if we are to think about where we need to do some major investing in change, it's in the institutional environment and what I would call the innovation environment, which is also right in the middling. So if I want to accelerate the momentum for India, those are the two places that actually need a lot more transformation than we currently have. Now, another way to look at this picture is by looking at the digital evolution scores vis-a-vis some benchmarks. So this diamond here is one way of doing that, where you look at the four categories of demand, supply, innovation, and institutions. And the diamond represents where a country is in terms of how far evolved you are. And so the fatter the diamond, the more filled out the diamond, the better it is, right? So you're further along on all these dimensions. And so the benchmarks I've sort of created here is Singapore, which of course is not a right comparison for India, but Singapore always comes up in practically every conversation about Asian and African countries. So I thought, why not Singapore? You can see Singapore has a nice, healthy diamond, so it's a good place to start. But then another natural comparison point quite often in India is China. So China is that red diamond, which is more shrunken than Singapore, but still a pretty reasonable sized ones. And then what I call perhaps the closest benchmark for India, which is the Asian 5. The ASEAN 5. So these are the ASEAN countries excluding Singapore. And that's the average of the ASEAN 5. And now the question is, where does India stand relative to these? So that's India. I'm going to try and go back in time, but I will not risk it. So the orange curve there, that's India. So you can see the biggest gap that India needs to close at an absolute level is the demand gap. Relative to these benchmarks, but then it is behind on the other parameters as well. And just for kicks, I also sort of added our South Asian neighbors, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which sort of hug India, but India does better than them marginally on kind of all fronts. Another way to do this comparison is against the so-called BRICS countries, which frankly I don't find a particularly interesting basket of comparisons, but you know what, India constantly keeps getting compared, so there you go, those are the BRICS, and India is inside the other BRICS, so suggests that we have some way to go. Now, as we were reflecting on the digital planet in my start, the opening of this discussion, I kind of mentioned that as we evolve from a physical past to a digital future, we're constantly questioning where all the fault lines are and whether we can actually trust this evolution. So it's interesting to ask the question, can I actually analytically understand and evaluate the state of digital trust around the world? And trust is one of those things that each one of us kind of knows it when we see it, but it's very hard to define it. Sir, what's your definition of trust?
It's like it's a very difficult to it's a feeling, and it's very difficult. It's very abstract of a concept. Yeah. So you actually don't define trust. You actually know when it's there, like you said.
Yeah. Just kind of like pornography. I think that's the other thing. You know it when you see it. But it's.
But trust, as you said, I mean, you know that, do I trust somebody that I'm doing a transaction with or not? Really hard to define. And so quite often, pointy-headed analysts, they kind of say, well, we need to actually get data on trust. So what do? They go out and do a survey. So they ask this room, Vikram, do you trust Mark Zuckerberg, on a scale of 0 to 10? And Vikram will give a score. He'll say 5. He's a gentleman. He's always kind of, right there in the middle. And then somebody else who's a much meaner person will give some other score and so on. And then you can ask, okay, do you trust the technology? Do you trust Silicon Valley? Do you trust, all that kind of stuff, right? So you can ask people all kinds of things. And many people will say, oh, I don't trust these companies at all. They're big, they collect all our data. Who knows what they're going to do with it? And then ask them, can you give me your phone? Can I keep it for 15 minutes? No, I don't want to be rid of my phone. So you can say that, well, what you say is not comparable to what you do, because people are on their phones all the time, even though they don't seem to trust it. So there's a different measure of trust, which is, are you actually willing to do without it? And do your behaviors reflect a different form of trust? Then there's a third way to measure trust, which is how trustworthy is the environment in which you operate? How much friction is there? When I try to make a phone call, is the sound jittery? Or does the phone call just hang up? Which it does a lot of the time. Or I'm trying to make a transaction, and before I finish the transaction, it says, we sent you a 3-digit code on your mobile phone. Enter the 3-digit code, and then we'll go through the next steps. So that slows things down. So is that building trust or taking away from trust? Unclear. Because on the one hand, it seems like it's building trust because somehow this verification process is meant to keep me safe. But it's taking away from trust because it's adding more time. I just want to get this transaction done with. So it's making, testing my tolerance. So there are many different ways to measure trust. And what we did was we actually said, let's use all those measures. And we collected data on attitudes, on behaviors, on environment, and the experience. And different parts of the world came out in different places in terms of trust. And I will spare you from squinting your eyes at this very hard to read picture, but really that star that just came up is India right here, and on the vertical axis it shows behavior. So the further to the north you are, the more trusting your behavior is, and the further to the right you are, the more trustworthy your environment is. So there are a whole bunch of countries here that are highly trusting, but in untrustworthy environments. A complete paradox. And when I look at the countries, it's countries like China, Vietnam, Chile, Philippines, Malaysia, Colombia, Indonesia, India, Thailand. And at the other end of the paradox are countries like South Korea, France, Australia, Germany, and Netherlands, very trustworthy environments, but people don't trust things at all. Extremely suspicious of the digital system. In South Korea, if it takes more than like half a second to complete a transaction or a website to load, the user is already gone. They've moved on to the next site. And this is what the data is telling us. So then it makes us think, what is going on in terms of why are these behaviors, why are our attitudes towards trust so widely different and so paradoxical? Now, I'm sure we can have a robust conversation about what could be going on here. My interpretation of what this data is saying is that when you look at countries like India, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, for us, this technology is actually something quite new. So we're still coming up this curve and discovering the magic of this thing, which is, for many people, it has just completely transformational. I mean, I grew up in India where you could not get a phone line, for the life of, for the love of God. But today, you can just buy a mobile phone in an airport and you're in business. And so that transformational effect, people say, I don't really care about all this privacy stuff. I just want to have my phone and do stuff with it. Whereas if you're in the Netherlands, you've had that phone for a long time, or you've had access to technology for a long time. Maybe not on the phone. It was on a laptop or on a desktop. So now I've become more attuned to what this technology can do and some of the challenges and the traps. So I'm much more skeptical about the technology. Now the reason why these distinctions matter is if you are Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure many of us would have liked to be Mark Zuckerberg at some point, maybe not today. And you've gone up and you made this massive public apology and said, oh, we're sorry, didn't mean it, we'll fix it, right? Not too much details, because actually poor guy doesn't have any details to offer. How's he going to fix the many messes that have sort of blown up in his face? Now, the first thing that he has to do when he goes back into the bunker with all the geniuses who are sitting there in the Facebook headquarters, ki bhai, how are you going to fix this stuff? So now those guys, they don't know what to do. I mean, there's all these fake news headlines being churned out by Macedonian teenagers, and how do I stop them? Do I put a star against them? Do I block them? What's my role? Am I an editor of a newspaper? Or am I, supposed to just be an open marketplace for ideas? So what Mark Zuckerberg, basically has to do, he has to pick and choose. He has to look at the world, and he has to say, where can I afford to let those fake headlines come through? And where can I not afford to have that happen? So for instance, if I lose the South Korean consumer, I'm screwed. Those guys bring in a ton of revenue for me. But the people in Myanmar, yeah, they're a future revenue source. But right now, I can let it slide a little bit. That's why the poor Rohingyas are continuing to be persecuted. And we can see that what's going to happen is when Zuckerberg converts his apologies into action, a lot of the investment is going to happen in that bottom right corner, where it really matters. So that's why a lot of this fairly complex graphs also translate into a little bit of a crystal ball in terms of where digital trust is going to go as the Zuckerbergs, as the Eric Schmidts and the Google boys and our own Indian boy who's along with them, as they continue to re-engineer what they have engineered. And I wouldn't call it a monster yet, but this creation, this Frankenstein's creation that they have put together. So I'm just going to kind of fast forward a lot of this. I just want to give you one quick image here. You can see the revolving star, there is India at the bottom of this chart. And this chart captures what I consider two essential measures of friction in a system. And the reason why friction is important is it tests our tolerance, and then it tests our trust. So a point of friction is bandwidth. So when I make a phone call, I'm speaking to the person and suddenly it drops. And it happens more frequently in India than it does in Sweden. Now, that's why India is down here. Now, the other friction is what I would call cart to conversion, which means if I go on Flipkart or go on Amazon and I filled up my shopping cart, and after that, from that point on, when I get a confirmation email which says, done, stuff is about to be shipped to your home, how much time does it take to complete that transaction? Again, India fares very poorly relative to Estonia or Slovenia or Peru or France. So if you are making decisions in a policy setting or in a tech setting, or you're an entrepreneur, or you're looking to invest some money, and you want to make a difference to digital India, trust is at the heart of this, and digital evolution is at the heart of it. These are the issues, these are the challenges. If you can help overcome them, you can actually transform the country in profound ways. So one question that we decided to explore is, how long does it take for India to play catch up? As you saw, what I showed before, there are many places where India is behind some of the relevant benchmarks, whether they are the ASEAN benchmarks or the Singapore benchmark or the Chinese benchmark. So a natural question to ask is, how far behind are we? And what do we need to do to close the gap? And that could help us as policymakers, decision makers, or even an institution like Brookings, kind of bring together the right stakeholders around the table and say, look, if we can collectively coordinate to fix the problem, then we can make this kind of a difference. So what I'll share with you is some analysis which personally I find absolutely exciting and I think could be critical to the way we engage in policy dialogue. Now, a question that I asked was, how long will it take and what will it take for India to catch up with those benchmarks I showed you before, with China, with the ASEAN 5? And also, I wanted to outline some of the critical levers of intervention, such as physical infrastructure, government facilitation of ICT, digital access, use of digital payments, gender inclusion. This is a big thing. How many women are involved in participating in the digital planet? India is a completely lopsided picture here. Research and development, mobile internet, and so on and so forth. Many different levers, and these levers actually have differential impact. The size of those bubbles reflect how much of an impact each of those levers would have in moving your digital evolution score from where it is today to where you would want it to be. Now, if India were to pick up the Chinese momentum, remember China in my previous graph was actually the fastest growing of the digitally evolving countries. If India were to pick up that momentum, it would get to where China is today in 2029, roughly about 10 years from now. It would get to Malaysia today by 2038. It could get to Singapore by 2054. And I could try a variety of permutation and combinations of this little science experiment. If India were to grow at 3% across all those levers I mentioned, it could get to China by 2022. If it grew by 5%, it could get to China in 2 years. And of course, that is a virtually impossible feat. But, I'm just saying. So now, what does this mean for you as a policymaker? I could come up with a scenario. I can ask the question, what does it take to get to China by 2024? And I can reverse engineer how much growth I need in individual parameters. So specifically, 18% annual growth in our measure of digital inclusion, 3% annual growth in physical infrastructure, 3% annual growth in R&D, and a modicum of growth in digital access. You'll get to China in 2024. Maybe that's not the policy goal, it's a different one. This is one scenario. You can come up with different combinations. So essentially, it's a way to use that same analytical engine to set an end game for this chess game that we are playing and work out the moves that will get you there. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with PowerPoint, but I want to share a couple of other points of analysis that I think would be relevant if you were to take this even further. So far we've been talking about these questions almost at it's like Neil Armstrong, the picture I showed you. He was on the moon, he was looking down, and of course that time there was no digital. The computer that took him to the moon was 1/1,000,000th the power of the computer that you exchange with your neighbor. Did you get it back, Vikram? Did you get your smartphone back from this young man? Or you never exchanged it in the first place? Never gave it to him, okay. Yeah, right. Yeah, who knows what he's going to do on it? Yeah. Ruin your reputation forever. So instead of that top-down view, actually go down to a country level and ask the question, if you are a policymaker, if you are Mr. Modi, or if you're Amitabh Kant, if you're any of the people who are in those positions of being able to pull together the right elements, what do we need to do to enable a society using technology? So the first question I would ask then is, well, technology is kind of nice. All of us seem to like our smartphones. But technology is not the end in itself. From a policymaker's perspective, there are outcomes I want to achieve. And those outcomes have to do with the well-being of my people, the robustness of my economy, and functioning of institutions. Ultimately, that's what policymakers are supposed to want. Of course, they want other things as well. They want to get re-elected, or they want to have their own pet projects. But in theory, that's the goal of the public service. And now, what we can do is we can create a framework for identifying policy goals, and we can also break those goals down into individual pillars organized by people, institutions, and economy. And what I've got here is 12 major pillars, but underneath the 12 are many, many indicators. There are a total of 242 different indicators within this spider web that I'm about to create. And we also created a global benchmark of a smart society. And the way we came up with a global benchmark for a smart society is we asked the question, which countries in the world are the digitally most advanced, represent the digitally most advanced governments. And it turned out there is a group called the D5. How many of you have heard of the D5? Good. That makes me feel good. Oh, one person. Sir, what's the D5?
So I've just heard like the most advanced countries in the world, like digitally which are have a proper institution set up and are very much advanced in technology, digitally basically.
Yeah.
I've just heard so, and I was reading it through the newspaper.
The D5, virtually in any room I've talked to, I just get blank stares. And I didn't know what the D5 was. The D5 is like the G20 or the G7. It's a club of the digitally most advanced governments in the world. And are these the most powerful governments in the world? No, because they can include countries like Estonia, not a terribly powerful government. Israel, which has power in many ways, but not a big one. New Zealand. Most people didn't even know where New Zealand is. It's like Pluto. It kind of, I don't even remember that it's part of this planet. And then there's South Korea, which, any of you who've been to South Korea know it's a digitally advanced country. And the United Kingdom, people roll their eyes. United Kingdom? Come on. That doesn't seem like a digitally advanced country. It turns out these 5 are the digitally most advanced countries in the world. So they actually are very useful in setting a global benchmark. If I can somehow create the best of these 5. So what we did was, of those 242 different indicators, we picked the best performing indicator from each of the governments, and we created a mythical government. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings. We created our own version of the Lord of the Rings land, and the best of the 242 drawn from each of the countries, constitutes that outer polygon. Okay, so inside this, I can map any country. So this is Estonia. And it turns out Estonia has captured the imagination of governments around the world because nobody had even heard of Estonia. And it turns out they're a digital rock star. And this is how Estonia compares against that mythical country. So Estonia, the size of its, that cobweb represents how much you have advanced in creating a digital society, a smart society. And the gap between you and where you are and this outer edge is the gap that you need to close, and the dimensions along which you need to close it. So that footprint for each country can tell you where the country is: Israel, New Zealand, South Korea, and those of you who were doubting the United Kingdom, that's the United Kingdom. Now, when I showed this in a meeting in London, people literally jumped out of their seats because this has huge implications for the Brexit discussions. Because with the United Kingdom separating, the EU, which has been struggling, remember Donald Rumsfeld, old Europe, the stall-out countries, they're going to get even more stalled as they lose a very powerful player in the UK. But I'm straying from my point. What we are doing now is we're actually putting India on this map as well. So we are in the process of creating so this is like a dashboard for every country. So this is an example for New Zealand. That's the footprint of New Zealand. And for every major indicator, where the country ranks and what gaps it needs to close. And currently we're doing this study for India, Mexico, Nigeria, Philippines, Poland, and Ireland. So these are all countries roughly in that same neighborhood of the Digital Evolution Index. And they are the ones that I consider to be among the kind of the breakout countries, the most interesting ones to watch. They're very different in many ways, but they provide a very interesting set of comparison points. Over the last couple of days, I've now had conversations with several agencies here in Delhi, and the observation that we jointly had was India is obviously not a country, it's a collection of countries. And so if I were to do a similar analysis for Andhra Pradesh, it's going to look very different for analysis for Bihar or analysis for Haryana. So we can actually do a similar thing. We're changing the unit of analysis, and even the national capital region itself could be a unit of analysis. And I could compare it to New Zealand. And frankly, New Zealand is smaller than the national capital region, I think, in many ways. So, so that's where we are going, and once we understand that, it gives us a better sense of where the gaps are, what the footprint is, how do you close those gaps, and what role technology can play in closing those gaps. So I have really taken up much more of the time that speaking from up here than engaging in a discussion. But I thought I didn't want to kind of just leave you with an image of a dark digital planet with, of course, Vladimir Putin riding on horseback into the future, but also not overwhelming with data, but hopefully giving you a few different facets, a few different ways to kind of look at this picture. But it's also interesting to ask the question, where are we going? Because digital ultimately is all about the future. So if we ask where are we going, you can't really get a good answer in a think tank-like environment like this. I'm sorry. You are an incredible group, very thoughtful group, but you're not the people I would ask. I would actually ask my students, because their average age is closer to the ground of what is happening in the digital system. So I asked them, where are things going? And as we know, the digital path that we've been on has taken us, a good 25 plus years, and we're constantly moving along. And the natural question to ask is, what's the next big story that is going to show up on the cover of The Economist magazine in 2030? And I asked my students to create Economist covers, and they come up with, I've got hundreds of them here. Some of them are dark covers. Some of them are perhaps a little bit more uplifting, or maybe slightly scary. So I just want to close with a story of one of our students. His name is Patrick Meyer. He was a PhD student, and a few years back he was doing what most PhD students do, either hanging around the library or looking for free food in the corridor. And he heard about the Haiti earthquake, and it turned out that his girlfriend at that time, she was in Haiti, and she was kind of basically trapped. And he mobilized a piece of software, which eventually became a movement called Ushahidi. How many of you have heard of Ushahidi? So it's a crisis mapping. So this gentleman, Born Vita Quiz Contest, my friend, Ushahidi is a way to map crises as they're happening. So whether it's a civil war, or it's a tsunami, or it's an earthquake, and people are trapped, and all they have is Twitter or some other form of social media, and they're sending out messages saying, I'm here, and you can direct public safety to where the greatest points of danger are. So he actually used a piece of software to find his girlfriend. And then now he's one of the world's leading digital humanitarians. He flies into places where there are tsunamis and earthquakes and helps use digital technology to help people. So I started with a picture of landing, all the, that chill that goes down the back of our spine when we even recall landing men on the moon. And today, this digital technology, that's why I'll leave with a note of optimism, that despite all the concerns and the fault lines, this digital technology, by some of the most creative people, many of them in this room and others that I've met over the last several years, are using this technology to land men right here on Earth where they're needed, and in ways that we could never have imagined before. So I think my friend Sunil and I were asking this question, do you trust the digital planet? And I won't reveal Sunil's answer. He asked me, do you trust the digital planet? I sort of hemmed and hawed. And part of the reason why I hemmed and hawed is I actually am pretty optimistic about where things are going because of stories like this. And I'll just leave on one more note. Patrick married his girlfriend, and now they have a little baby, and they're doing fine. So with that, thank you so much, and happy to take questions or discussions.